It is 9:35. Good morning to you once again. Thanks for being with us. A lot of info on the top 9 and 9. Obviously, we can't get to the details of all of it, but we'll do what we can. Again, we're going to talk to a councilman from Maple Heights, possibly the council president, too, at the top of the next hour. Going to talk about a couple of other important bills. Sponsor testimony is needed. Proponent testimony is needed on a very important bill that Stephanie Stock will tell us about with Ohio Advocates for Medical Freedom. That'll be at 10:35 this morning. But for now, let's talk about voting. And more specifically, not about who you're going to vote for, but will your vote be tabulated correctly? And will your vote be offset by somebody who is casting a vote who is not eligible to do so? Not registered or not legally registered. The state of Ohio, like every other state, has got some issues and it's got some problems. It's been called by many, including our Secretary of State, the gold standard for election integrity and for valid and trustworthy elections. But there are some people who have been looking into it saying maybe not so much. And we have to make sure that it is as good as it can possibly be. So joining us now is Marcell Strbich. He is a retired Air Force intel officer, and he is an elections advocate and activist. And he joins us on AM 1420, The Answer. Marcell, welcome back. It's good to hear you again. How are you, sir?
It's good. It's really good to be here. We have an action plan to safeguard our elections going into November, so I'd like to share that with your audience.
That's what it's all about. So let's talk about this action plan. Now, as I understand it, you guys have delivered your election integrity team in support of HB 472. You've already delivered this plan to the Secretary of State, right?
Yes, we have. We put this forward. We're waiting to hear back, and we'd like to sit down and discuss it. We need to move forward.
Tell us about it. Seven-point plan,
I'll tell you a little bit about it, but let me set the conditions here before we jump into the solution set, because we got to define the issue and the problem, right? So at the end of the day, we hear the announcement yesterday. This happens every year, 159,000 or so, give or take. They get removed from the voter records, and everybody just goes back to business, and then we revisit this every single year. But that doesn't solve the issue. The issue here is, should a person whose voter registration has some unresolved issue be allowed to vote a regular ballot, Bob? And that, according to Ohio law, that includes an absentee ballot. Right now, no requirement for photo ID there. The answer from the standpoint of election fairness advocates is no. Not until the information is validated and verified as accurate should a regular ballot even be voted. Otherwise, what you have is a trust system and an honor system, which is what we operate on. But we don't verify, and as a result, we create a susceptibility for bad actors down the road within the process to exploit it. So we try to tackle this issue at the very front. And what the Secretary of State will do is follow the law, but the law is written in such a limited way that not all the categories of record get screened or criteria. Let me give you an example. So of the 159,000, we went back and essentially he looked at, or the team there looked at the fact that these are moves that occurred from residents that left the state of Ohio in 2020. So they're only now, in their 4 years in arrears, removing those. What about years 21, 22, 23? So we see this whole kind of characterization of the non-citizen audit, remove 137, remove 159. But in reality, this song and dance is limited, and we're not addressing the propensity of the problem. And what is the propensity of the problem? It is 1.7 million records that have some form of unresolved status that remain unaddressed going into November. So we've got a big lift to do, and we've got to focus that, and that's really what the intent of our efforts is going to be toward.
Do we have like an idea of what those, some of those, what are we calling them, irregularities or problems with registrations? I mean, can we put them in categories? Or are we talking about illegals trying to register to vote? Are we talking about people who moved? What does that look like?
We can certainly put them. It's a good question. We could certainly put them in categories. And a big part of what we're talking about here, because the big resistance is we don't want to necessarily remove records in the event that there could be an error on the part of the administrators in having done that, and that, of course, beckons some type of legal matter. What we're talking about here is using a type of status called provisional status. And what this does is it doesn't remove a record, it doesn't deny a prospective voter from actually going and casting a ballot, but what it does is it presupposes that they have to present evidence and information before that vote can count. They have 4 days to do so, according to Ohio law. So what if we took all the existing electors that are in some form of a dispute status? What if we took this non-citizen category, which we know there's over 236,000 that have voter ID, potential voter ID credentials, okay? Not necessarily registered, but have credentials. And We ensure that we conduct more frequent checks with the Board of Motor Vehicles. That's a big part of what our first part of our STEP plan is for the SOS to do that. He can do that on a more recurring basis than what the law says, which is go ahead and do an annual audit. So we can do that now. And then what we can do from there is we can cross-check that off of voter registration records, put them in provisional, and that would then require the second part of our action plan, which is the training of the poll workers to identify non-citizen driver's licenses when voting. So what does that mean? That means that they have to be aware of what to look for. And what we have received feedback from across the board, Board of Election Directors don't have yet the guidance or the training requirements, despite the fact we've had multiple elections since the passage of HB 458, to look at and to be able to see if somebody, and understand if somebody is actually in front of them who's a non-citizen. So we have to, at a minimum, address those two, which run concurrent to each other, the U.S. citizenship verification piece, by flagging them for provisional, and then train our poll workers so that when they have to now come in person because they can't vote by absentee ballot when you're in provisional status, that they're able to support this process of safeguarding. Those are the two big ones, and then there's also 4 others.
Yeah, well, let's do that. I thought it was a 7-point plan. Did I miss that? Did I miss one?
There is a big discussion on the copy of the photo ID, but that may involve the need of the legislation because of the fact that HB 458 deliberately left the copy of the photo ID out for absentee ballots. We could certainly talk about that, but that's something I think.
Let's run through all of the points, even on a cursory level, and then I want to talk about what response there has been, if any at all, from the Secretary of State now that they have received this. So you've got 1 and 2. Let's talk about the next 4 then.
So the next one's identity verification, and like I said, should somebody be allowed to cast a regular ballot up front if they have not, at the end of the day, been verified or validated by election administrators? And the answer is the way to solve that is to put them in pending status. Other states do this, and what this does is it allows time for the driver's license, the state identification, and the last 4 of Social Security to actually match authoritative data, which is the Board of Motor Vehicles and Social Security Administration record. The way this should really work, Bob, is the Board of Elections should have access to those authoritative records. What the Secretary of State, by de facto of solely doing this, has put that office, which has to have oversight of 88 different offices right across our counties, they're the ones doing the propensity of the validation, and it should be inverse. It should be the County Board of Elections doing it, and they should be the ones to be able to resolve this before the actual voter ID is actually issued. That's something to work long-term toward, but in the more immediacy, we think all administrative records that are currently in place today between now and October, rather than remove, because we know that's a limiting factor. You can't remove them, in essence, after August 7th. Flag them for provisional, and that includes non-citizens. So that pending status is a tool that the administrators have that they can use. Then there's the residency verification. I want to spend some time talking about this. In September of 23, we know
before you go on, hold on. Before you go on to residency verification, I'm trying to recall. I feel like the last time we spoke, we talked about the last one about matching the federal records with state records. But is that going to take an act of Congress? I don't recall.
No, it's not. It's really everything we're presenting now at this point is really what we think that is we're confident is within the plenary authority of the Secretary of State. Case in point, we use
to
what's
get
called
records from the feds.
Yeah, well, that's a separate story as far as the government databases that house U.S. citizens. The bottom line is the Board of Motor Vehicles has the information of non-citizens. They retain it, and if a non-citizen applicant fills out that form, they send that, even though they know that person was a non-citizen, they send it to the Secretary of State. It's the Secretary of State's duties to therefore determine the eligibility and whether to put them on the voter record. So it's not the Board of Motor Vehicles' job to determine eligibility. It's their job to process the information and send it to the Secretary of State. That's a big point, and that's what's getting lost in this whole mix. Okay.
So number 4 was residency verification, right?
Right. Residency verification, which is done through something that we think is insufficient. It's the National Change of Address. It's a record that the Postal Service sends to the Secretary of State that says, a person of Ohio has moved to a county or has moved out of state. Now, according to our law, in order to determine that somebody's lost residency, intent has to be met. And here's what I think is the biggest thing that can happen to solve this issue, which is residency verification. So when somebody surrenders a driver's license, that is intent, Bob, right? I surrendered my driver's license to become an Ohio resident after 20 years in the military. I gave away my residency in my former state to come to Ohio.
Sure.
So that's clear as day. And the Secretary of State tomorrow can go to the Board of Motor Vehicles and can say, I would like all of the information on surrender driver's license information for those years that he's in that waiting period before he's going to do that 4-year record removal. So we have an ability to get that information and to apply the same principle. How many electors is that? That's 180,000 people. That's more people than he just removed that he would now have access to look at that have had some form of, we would know, intent that have left the state of Ohio. And so in the past, I don't know if you recall this, but the Secretary of State has noted that he has had to refer over 500 people over the years for double voting in the state. We think that if he asks for the surrender driver's license information, he doesn't have to worry or have that much of a problem. See, what's happening now is Ohio residents are seeing these gaps. They're going out. They're giving their time. They're going out, putting their money in information systems, and they're coordinating across other states to identify people who've double voted. And they're taking that information to the Secretary of State's appointed board of directors, elections directors, and they're not able to do anything with this proven information because they're frustrated, and they're saying, we don't have the guidance from the Secretary of State to be able to remove this. And so this is something that has to be addressed at his level, and he has to give that type of guidance to them to say, this is how you handle these challenges, and even better, we don't even have to rely on a citizen army of volunteers across Ohio. He can simply use this information he has authority over, and he can start to promulgate that, and he won't have to wait 3 years like we currently do. So like anybody moving out of Ohio, Bob, in 2024, the next Secretary of State is going to look at that 4 years from now and remove them from the record. We think that's unacceptable. That's not the way we pay property tax. We don't do 4 years in arrears, right? And if we did, then our municipalities would be broke. Is our voter records and the legitimacy and accuracy of this any less important than our property taxes? I don't think so.
No, I would agree. Let's move on to the last three because obviously we have got a time consideration here. What's the next one?
The next one's the identity verification and registering to vote online. There are not very strong validation and verification checks. The person who's submitting to register is who they say they are. We're living in an era of high identity theft. What we're recommending is that something along the lines of the Board of Motor Vehicles, and when you go and you renew your online license or your tag, you got to go through a litany of questions, both security-based as well as questions that involve multi-factor authentication. We think adding a similar type of set of authentication features is very important in this day and age when information can be obviously stolen from the dark web and people could be applying, registering, and having absentee ballots sent out. And we think the solution, once again, resides within the Board of Motor Vehicles. And then the final one is training agency employees out there, the Department of Family Job Services. They actually have better data than election administrators when it comes to non-citizens, and they're the first line of defense. So what we think is that the Secretary of State, who does provide them guidelines on how to address voter registration application handling, should prescribe a program to train the state agencies and the Board of Motor Vehicle employees to provide assistance for voter registration to actually advise applicants that they don't qualify to vote. Somebody needs to be able to tell them, Bob, I'm sorry, you don't qualify. Here are the criteria. And if then they go ahead and they still sign it, that's another story. But we don't get the impression that state agencies are doing that. In fact, we're hearing different stories in the Cleveland area separately, where at these agencies, Catholic Charities and others are very open with administering these type of applications. And that's something that I'm getting more information from another retired military service member who's privy to this, that has come across this. So this is something that's only going to grow in terms of importance and spotlight, and we really hope that the authorities that are getting this information from us really start to pay attention and really start to not just look at this like any other year. We're under assault in many ways with what has been opened up, and we have to also, this election cycle, unlike last election cycle, account for hundreds of thousands of non-citizens pouring in.
We are talking with Marcell Strbich, a retired Air Force intel officer and an advocate for free and fair and valid elections in the state of Ohio. So this 7-point action plan that you and your team have put together here to safeguard the vote, you said that the Secretary of State has it. You've just listed a few of the things that seem pretty commonsensible to me. What has been the reaction or response from the Secretary of State, or has their office even acknowledged it?
I think there's an acknowledgement, and there's been through secondary channels a kind of an indication that they would talk about this. But, I'm a person of action, not words. We haven't been able to sit down for months since we issued HB 472, which is the legislation that a lot of these core issues have kind of now filtered out of, recognizing the House and the Senate are about to adjourn for June, and the quite likely the possibility, that it's not going to necessarily move at the pace we want it to move. We basically went into, okay, fine, let's get down to the implementation side of what can be done. And I think that's where we're now starting to converge with the Secretary of State's office. And we're just going to keep highlighting. We're going to take this message beyond Ohio. We're already there. We're letting people know what's going on. It's only going to continue to grow. So until we address this issue and we start to fundamentally change the way we do business to truly safeguard these susceptibilities, we're not going away, and we're only going to grow. And
do you think that
continue to propagate.
Do you think that the Secretary really takes all of these things seriously? And I ask that only because, again, yesterday you started your commentary on this morning with the news that 159,000 voter registrations are going to be canceled for inactivity. This was just literally announced yesterday. So I kind of feel like the Secretary, Frank LaRosa's office, if not he himself, are going to say, look, we're all over this. Look at what we've done here. We've got the cleanest voter rolls that there are. The concerns that you are raising here, they may be valid concerns, but they don't impact a large number of people here at all. If they do, we are catching them.
It's hard for me to tell you the answer, honestly, because I haven't been able to sit down with our group and talk to them and understand what are their limitations, how are they planning to...
Well, that's kind of an answer in and of itself, isn't it, Marcell? The fact that they won't sit down is kind of, to me anyway, it says, hey, thanks for your efforts, guys, but we got this. We don't really need to sit down here. We're on top of things. Look, we just found 159,000 names that are in question here. So, you know what I mean? The fact that they won't talk to you says we've got this well in hand.
We are always going to push the message one way or the other, and we're going to get results one way or the other. We can't do it without them. There's no doubt about that. We understand they've got a number of things to have to balance, but we're living in unprecedented times right now. And there's a lot at stake coming up. You've been very articulate about that, very passionate about that. It's why I like coming on your show. It's like your audience is this way. Everybody's authentic. This is who we are. We operate in good faith, and we have always been ready to operate. We're reasonable, which is why we came up with common sense solutions. We know there's limitations that the Secretary of State and the Board of Elections have. Our experience is when we start to go down the road and we start to hit on an angle that's uncomfortable, they start finger pointing. And I come from a world of results and outcome oriented. I've supported units downrange in Afghanistan like Rangers and others. We don't look at the end of the day for blame. We're mission oriented people. That's the way I take my approach to this type of work. And that's why I'm passionate, because at the end of the day, I've seen how things go sideways when elections don't work well overseas. And I don't want any more further trepidation for people to be involved in the elections process. We want to restore everybody back to the table, probably more closer to where we were before the year 2000. And that's why we have to go back fundamentally, Bob, and we have to look at where the issues began, okay, and not look at these, these blips that are good for just pointing out and putting out, as a press release. Okay, done. Well, what about why it continually happens? And that's what's the power of our message. We may not have the authority, but what we have is we've got the right argument, and that's what's going to win over in the end, one way or the other.
Marcell, what's frustrating about this for me, and I think for a lot of people who have been listening, and by the way, the articulation is from you, and this is the reason I have you on, because you have been studying this and you are an absolute expert at all of this, so I bring you on so you can educate me as well as others. And from my education at your teaching, the problem here is that they're treating this like if they are going to address it at all, that it's a long-term solution. They're going to look at this in the future. But we've got 4 months before people start voting in November. And it's frustrating to think that many of these steps in that action plan that you just listed could be taken now in time for this election to make sure that this particular election is secured and can be trusted and is valid. And it doesn't seem like they're interested in moving at the speed necessary to make that happen, does it?
I reserve judgment in the end to what the result is come November, right? And there's always time to come back into this conversation and to say, okay, we can take on a few of these things. Leadership is about doing what's hard and what you don't want to do. When everybody tells you, oh, you're doing a great job, keep it up, it's not really leadership to make easy decisions. When you need to make hard decisions, and not everybody likes those decisions, which is what, my experience, having been with combat units, you have to do things you don't necessarily want to do. It's the same way here. I apply that kind of mentality when it comes to looking at this stuff. It's important. I'm so glad that there's reputable people out there that understand that are going to help us continue to get this message out. And in the end, we want all the people who are in positions of authority to get credit. We want them all to take a victory lap on this. This is a selfless thing. We don't care. I don't do this for money. Our group's not funded by individuals. We're not a special interest group. We're one of the very, very rare breeds. I went up and did proponent testimony in Columbus, and we have a good rep up there by you, Representative Demetriou, who's an Army infantry officer. He's not far, I think, northeast of Cleveland. And, he co-sponsored HB 472. And this is the comment he made, which was really revealing. He goes, it's not often that we get people coming up here to give proponent testimony who are citizens, who are just out here, who know the issues, who are bonded together by the importance of it. And he took appreciation at it. And I found that to be the most comforting comment going up there, whereas all these other things and people were diverting and people were like trying to bring up issues that were irrelevant to what we were trying to present. That was the gamesmanship, right? And it's so evident when you see the gamesmanship up there. And he did not have that mindset. So I thank him for that. And I think anybody who supports HB 472, that in due time will also come ripe of age. Even if it doesn't happen now, it will, because those issues and these problems are not going away within the system.
Yeah, clearly not. And I really thank you once again for staying on top of this, sharing the information with all of us so that we can, of course, talk to our legislators. And in my case, if I have access to Secretary LaRose, again, keep pushing him and his team to make sure that these things are all reviewed and all of these action steps are being considered, if not implemented, as soon as humanly possible, because every single election matters. Just like every vote matters, every single election that we have matters. Marcell Strbich, thank you for what you're doing, and keep it up, and we'll talk again.
All right, Godspeed. Bye.
Thank you.